You have the same number of hair follicles on your scalp at birth as you'll ever have in your entire life. Not one new follicle forms after that point, which makes what happens to half of all men by their 50s genuinely strange, because losing that hair isn't wear and tear, and it isn't random. It's actively programmed into your DNA, waiting to switch on. To understand why that's bizarre, you have to remember why your ancestors kept scalp hair in the first place, back when almost every other patch of body hair disappeared. Anthropologists studying human hair loss agree the scalp was one of the deliberate exceptions to fur loss, not an accident. A layer of hair on top of the head shields the skull and brain from direct equatorial sun. The single most dangerous exposure a walking, upright primate faces in open grassland. That protective logic held for millions of years and still holds for most of the body's remaining hair today. Eyebrows keep sweat and debris out of your eyes. Eyelashes do similar work. Scalp hair protects the one organ evolution has invested the most in building. So, if scalp hair exists for protection, male pattern baldness should be one of the worst traits a human body could develop, and yet it's one of the most common. By age 30, roughly a third of men already show visible hair loss. By 50, that number is close to half. This isn't an injury or a disease in the traditional sense. It's a specific, targeted, hormone-triggered shutdown of hair follicles concentrated on the top and front of the scalp, while the sides and back are left completely untouched. If sun protection were the only force at work here, this pattern makes no sense. Why would evolution build in a switch that disables the exact protective structure it spent millions of years installing? The mechanism responsible is called androgenetic alopecia, and it runs on the same hormone family responsible for a completely different, much more celebrated trait in men: facial hair. Testosterone gets converted through an enzyme called 5-alpha reductase into a more potent hormone called dihydrotestosterone, or DHT. On the jaw and chin, DHT binds to androgen receptors and drives thicker, denser hair growth, which is part of why a full beard reads as a signal of high androgen exposure. But on the scalp's crown and hairline, in men genetically predisposed to it, that exact same hormone does the opposite. DHT binds to receptors in scalp follicles and gradually shortens their growth cycle, causing each generation of hair to grow back thinner, shorter, and less pigmented than the last, until eventually the follicle stops producing visible hair at all. Same hormone, same receptor mechanism, completely opposite result, depending entirely on which patch of skin it's acting on. Here's where the trait gets genuinely strange from a genetic standpoint. The single strongest genetic predictor of male pattern baldness sits on the X chromosome, in a gene near the androgen receptor itself. Because men inherit their only X chromosome from their mother, the classic folk wisdom turns out to be more accurate than most inherited traits. Your baldness risk is disproportionately tied to your maternal grandfather, not your father, something most men never learn until they're already losing hair and asking why. So if this trait offers no protective advantage and actively undoes millions of years of sun protection evolution, something else has to explain why the genes behind it are still so common. And once again, as with the beard, the answer researchers keep landing on isn't survival, it's signaling, just aimed in a completely different direction. In 1996, a study published in the journal Ethology and Sociobiology tested how people perceive men with different degrees of hair loss and found something counterintuitive. Where thick facial hair reads as aggressive dominance, thinning or receding hair reads as something else entirely: social maturity, non-threatening authority. The kind of status associated with wisdom and experience rather than physical aggression. Participants consistently rated balding men as older and specifically as more socially mature, not as weaker or less capable. A 2018 paper carried the theory even further, in research bluntly titled Male Pattern Hair Loss, Taking One for the Team. Its authors proposed that hair loss functions as a visible marker correlated with advancing paternal age, and that advancing paternal age carries a real, measurable cost. Pregnancies fathered by older men show higher rates of miscarriage and complications than those fathered by younger men. Their argument is that male pattern baldness, by making age more visible and steering reproductive preference toward younger, non-balding men, may function as a population-level nudge that improves the overall reproductive success of the species, even though it comes at the direct expense of the specific individual man losing his hair. It's evolution optimizing for the group by sacrificing information about the individual, written directly onto his forehead. Layer these two forces together and the picture starts to resemble something you've heard before, just running in reverse. Scalp hair persisted because it protected the skull. Losing it in a specific, hormonally triggered pattern persisted anyway, alongside that protective trait, because the loss itself became a legible, honest signal, this time not of dominance but of maturity and paternal age. Something a rival, a mate, or a social group could size up from across a clearing without a single word being exchanged. One force built the shield. A different force found a way to make removing part of it useful too, which brings you to your own bathroom mirror. Today, you have entire industries built around undoing exactly this signal. Minoxidil, finasteride, hair transplant surgery, all designed specifically to block DHT from doing what it evolved to do, or to physically relocate follicles from the sides of your scalp, which are genetically immune to DHT's effects, up to the crown and hairline, where they're not. Millions of men actively fight every single day against a signal their own bodies are trying to broadcast. A signal that may have been quietly working in favor of the species the entire time it was working against the individual wearing it. Your ancestors never got a vote on any of this. The hormone did what it was going to do. The follicles responded exactly as their genes instructed, and whoever was watching drew their own conclusions about maturity, status, and age from a pattern they couldn't consciously read but responded to anyway. You, on the other hand, get to argue with it. A pill, a procedure, a shaved head worn as a deliberate choice instead of a biological outcome. Either way, the same ancient signal is still being broadcast from your scalp right now. Whether you're actively editing it or simply letting it play out exactly the way it was written millions of years before either of you had any say in the matter.